Okay, so this should be posted for Monday evening. Good to see you guys again. And so we are beginning the classical period looking at China. So last week was India. We are looking at China this week. One moment. Alright. So big picture themes, just to briefly review for this time period. New belief systems emerged and spread beyond political boundaries so that societies organized on the basis of religious and cultural traditions. Today when we look at China, we are really going to be looking at belief systems more so than religions. Taoism and Confucianism falls under more of a philosophy. Number two, the number and size of empires grew dramatically. So we're going to see how the Qin and then later the Han dynasties engaged in territorial expansion. The volume of long-distance trade, communication, exchange increased substantially. And so this week we're going to discuss the establishment of the Silk Trade routes. Big ideas, no single marker event initiated this time period. So if you looked at Sunday's video where I reviewed the Zhou dynasty, basically we got into the period of the Warring States, and then we're going to get into the dynasties of this time period. So that dynastic cycle is actually a continuity through Chinese history, so that's not a major shift. But what we will see is the size and political strength of the empires increase in Qin and Han China. Cultures will become more complex, so social hierarchies will be established, especially as we look at Confucianism. Increase in written records and long-distance trade is going to be a major component of this time period for China. More contacts between nomadic or pastoral people. One of the we'll see in two different contexts. One will be the issue of invasions from outside groups, but the other is that nomads are actually going to play a very important role in silk trade. So we'll discuss that this week as well. Alright, classical China. So an end to the period of the Warring States. Qin and Han China. So the period of the Warring States basically occurred after the fall of the Zhou dynasty. This will mark a period of political turmoil as regional warlords competed for power. It's going to prompt the development of three new philosophies on how best to stabilize and unify China. So we will see how the Qin dynasty utilizes legalism. This is a belief that humans are naturally evil and would only obey authority through force. So this is going to be a very strict, harsh rule for the Chinese. Taoism is a philosophy that people should avoid useless struggles and retreat from society. So the idea there is that the most harmonious society is the one that does not fight nature, kind of go with the flow, yin and yang. And then you have Confucianism. This emphasized the importance of hierarchical, harmonious relationships and the creation of an orderly society. So it really emphasized that everyone owed their propriety, proper behavior to basically someone that held a position above them, so parent-child or subject to ruler. So you have this video here on legalism, so if you're make sure you take time to view that. So Qin and Han China, the Qin dynasty. So the Qin dynasty was established by Qin Shi Huangdi. In fact, the name China comes from the Qin dynasty. He is considered the first emperor. He utilized legalist philosophy, so he was a harsh, strict ruler that worked to dominate his subjects. But through the process, he did establish the first strong centralized authority of China, and he did end the chaos of the period of the Warring States. So one of the questions we're going to explore this week when it comes to Qin Shi Huangdi is, was he a hero or was he a villain? He ruled through a centralized bureaucracy. He stripped the nobility of power. So remember when I discussed feudalism on Sunday that one of the weaknesses of feudalism is it relied on the loyalty of basically powerful lords and nobles. So the way he is going to establish his authority is actually to try to strip them of their power, and instead he is going to create government administrators, so basically think paid employees, to run his empire. He forced subjects to contribute their labor to the building of public works, and this will be the beginning of the building of the Great Wall of China. The wall is actually going to take thousands of years to complete, but this is the initial fortification that established the wall. And during this time, Confucians, basically philosophers that followed the Confucius teachings are going to widely criticize his rule. Legalism does not fall into compliance with Confucius beliefs, and his response is he's going to sentence many philosophers during this time period to death. So again, legalism, strict, harsh rule. He's also going to demand the burning of all books of philosophy, ethics, history, and literature. So basically any kind of knowledge source where people can possibly resist his methods. And he's only going to allow books such as medicine and agricultural, since they had a practical application. However, despite these strict policies, he did strengthen China in many ways. He standardized laws and currencies across the empire. He mandated that the Shang version of Chinese script be used all over the empire. So this at least established a consistent writing system across the empire. His dynasty will be short-lived. Shortly after his death, revolts will begin and result in the overthrow of his dynasty. And so if you watch the following video, you'll learn a little bit more about Qin Shi Huangdi and his infamous terracotta warriors. And so again, this is a note of like monumental architecture and art, and how might a ruler like Qin Shi Huangdi have used these methods to show that he was in charge. So after the Qin falls, there will be a very brief period instability, but very quickly the Han Dynasty will be founded by Liu Bang. He's going to create a strong, non-hereditary bureaucracy. So non-hereditary means you aren't born into your position of authority or power, you must earn it, merit. And the way that they prove their merit is actually the creation of a civil service exam that's based on Confucian ideas. And so that's going to be one method that the Han uses to establish their administration of the empire, is the use of merit-based bureaucrats. So bureaucrats were picked and organized in the new dynasty to help run the dynasty efficiently. And we're going to see this in a couple weeks when we look at the Romans. This will be a similar strategy. So remember, comparing and contrasting is something we do often in AP World. The Han Dynasty is going to de-emphasize, and it's clear, take note of that word de-emphasize. They don't completely eradicate legalism. They'll still use forced labor for things such as the Great Wall and infrastructure such as irrigation systems, but they are going to shift to a more tolerant method of rule, and they are going to shift over to Confucian values. There's still been a mandate or justify their power through the mandate of heaven, but as I mentioned, they are going to still maintain some legal structures from the Qin Dynasty. Family hierarchies become the basis for government structure. So this ties into Confucianism, which we'll see later in the PowerPoint. But just as a child should always be obedient to their parent, so should a subject be obedient to their government. So Confucianism is going to be the backbone of social organization throughout Chinese history. So it's another item that we'll call a continuity in this class. So subjects owed the same obedience that children gave their fathers. Han brought forward the Confucian value of benevolence to substitute the Qin strictness and reliance on force, also known as legalism. So Han Wudi is the most notable Han emperor. He, again, you still had to find methods to check the power of wealthy lords to maintain your power. And so what he did was, the main source of wealth and power was the amount of land you owned. And it became common that in order to keep these large tracts of land large, when a Chinese man passed away, all of his land immediately went to one son, usually the eldest. And that kept all the territory in one piece. And so Han Wudi realizes that if a man has more than one son, then upon his passing, it became law that he had to split the land amongst the various sons. And that way, that weakened that power base because the territories became smaller. And then a certain percentage of the territory had to be donated or given to the emperor. And so this also was a method to basically try to prevent nobles and lords from ever being able to effectively organize a rebellion or revolt against the Han Dynasty. Han rulers conquered territories. So the Han dynasty is actually larger than the Qin dynasty. They brought Chinese in contact with new peoples. There was trade with the Romans along the Silk trade routes. However, the contacts were indirect, and so I mentioned earlier that the nomadic peoples are going to play a key role in Silk Road trade. And essentially, what happened is, Chinese traders would travel so far, and they would trade their goods with nomadic peoples, Central Asians, and then they would travel with the goods, and they would meet with Roman traders and exchange the goods that way. So direct contact between Romans and the Han Chinese was pretty minimal, but pastoralists or nomadic groups were pretty important in the facilitation of trade along the Silk trade routes. Like the Qin, nomadic groups to the north were also a threat, so the Han dynasty is also going to have to deal with external weaknesses and invasions from nomads. And during the Han dynasty, the capital city is named the Forbidden City. And this is also, kind of think to yourself, what kind of message does this send to the subjects? But within the Forbidden City, in the capital, only the emperor, his family, his immediate servants, and closest advisors were allowed to live there. It was an extremely beautiful, lavish palace, and then no one was allowed to enter. And so again, kind of think to yourself, what kind of message does this send? And I put a link there of an image of the Forbidden City for you to get a visual idea of what it looked like. So also take a moment to watch this brief video on the Han Dynasty. There's a few more useful tidbits of information. So a little bit more of Han society. Han China was an urban empire, so that means you had the growth of cities and towns that ruled a rural and peasant population. 30% of the population lived in towns and cities. This is a major shift from being primarily peasants and farmers to having more specialization of labor and activities for people to engage in urban areas. Canals were built, road systems were expanded, so those are considered accomplishments under the Han Dynasty. And silk production is really going to flourish during this time period, and it was a highly guarded secret, meaning that the Chinese did not share their methods of how they created their silk cloths with anybody. So what that means is they created a monopoly. Anyone who wanted silk had to trade with the Chinese to get silk, and they had a very specialized process with the moths and the mulberry trees, I believe, and how they wove the fine pieces. And so you don't really have to memorize the process of silk production, but just understand that the Chinese kept it a highly guarded secret so that no one else can replicate their process. Despite merchants becoming wealthy and bringing money into the empire and starting to gain success, because of Confucian values, they're always going to be considered suspicious or greedy, and so they're not really going to be revered in society. The people that are held with the highest regard are really the Shi, or the scholar bureaucrats, sometimes called mandarins. And so these are the people that had to become educated in Confucian values, took the exam, and became government bureaucrats. So social classes under the Han, so at the when I say the highest, of course, this is, excluding the emperor and his, immediate family. But you have the scholar gentry, so also known as the Shi, and they were held in the highest regard because they were able to pass the Confucian-based civil service exam. You next have ordinary but free citizens. So the majority of these individuals were peasants. And even though peasants are so mistreated and they're poor in a state of poverty through Chinese history, they're actually, from a moral or ethical standpoint under Confucian values, they're very highly regarded as, for producing food and being the backbone of society. Unfortunately, they could sometimes be forced to join the military or public works projects that were very, back-breaking labor and very arduous. And then you had the underclass. So sometimes this was slaves. Slavery is not as, widespread in China. It consisted of many different groups. Oftentimes it was like ethnic non-Han Chinese that were considered the lowest parts of society. So despite not being given a high status, however, during this time period, artisan and manufacturing classes grew. So this is why, Han Dynasty really shifted to more urban populations. And a lot of this was due to new inventions and technologies. So the brush pen made it easier to write quicker, so create government records. Water mills contributed to agricultural production. Rudders and compasses for ships, and so the Chinese are really going to be on the forefront of maritime exploration and navigation, and a lot of their technologies through time, such as the compass, the rudders, the astrolabe. Eventually we'll talk about that in a few weeks with period 3. Those technologies are going to spread to other cultures like the Europeans that enable them to eventually engage in worldwide navigation. And new mining techniques for iron and copper production. And calligraphy during this time period becomes the highest art form because it was seen as an artistic rendering of the written record. So decline of the Han. So the Han Dynasty lasted for about 400 years, and when you watch when you watch that previous video, it does mention that there was a brief gap in Han rule. So sometimes, like the textbook refers to early Han versus later Han, but in reality, for our purposes, the Han Dynasty pretty much lasted around 400 years. The last 200 years was a period of gradual decline. Their difficulties were defending long borders from nomadic invasions. That is very expensive. Despite attempts to undermine the authority of lords and nobles by breaking up their tracts of land, there was still always the possibility of revolt and rebellion. And so what you're going to watch next actually is the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And it's a different kind of video, but I think it might be fun for some of you guys to watch. But it explores the issues of why did the Yellow Turban Rebellion occur, and this is something that ties into the key concepts, so make sure you take note of that. But after the Han of the dynasty, China is going to enter a pretty brutal period for about 135 years, known as the period of the Three Kingdoms, and the video talks about that a bit as well. So I hope you enjoy that. Alright, so this is a good time if you want to take a break. This was something I mentioned to some students in the station rotation, that if you want to hit pause, go eat a snack, whatever. I am about halfway through, but sometimes it helps to get up and move around. So now we're going to shift to belief systems, and in the key concepts they tend to say belief systems, not religion. The reason being is because during this time period, some things are more traditionally religion in that they might be believing in a higher spiritual being. But in this case, Confucianism and Taoism was more a philosophy or a way of life. It wasn't really a religion, so we're going to use the phrase belief systems. So Confucianism, founded by Confucius, who lived in the late Zhou era during the period of the Warring States. And he didn't actually write down his teachings, his followers did, and they compiled his teachings into a collection known as the Analects after his death. And this is going to become the text or source of information that the Confucius Civil Service exam will be based upon. Basically, Confucius built on earlier Chinese traditions, including the mandate of heaven and the yin and yang principle of opposite forces in harmony. And then from there he develops out his really strict ideas on social hierarchies and the relationships that should guide all behavior amongst people from person to person. So in this process he felt this would create, if everyone followed these relationships and these expectations of behavior, essentially this would naturally create social harmony and order. The philosophy rests on the principle of reciprocity. Excuse me. And so this is the notion that people give and take equally within the context of the 5 basic relationships of society. So those relationships is parent-child, sovereign-minister, husband-wife, older-younger brother, and friend-friend. And if you look at that, the first 4 really are based on some sense of hierarchy. You have one person holds a position of power over the other. And this is going to guide basically social structure within Chinese history. Other components of the Confucius belief system, filial piety is the devotion of the individual to the family and strong ties that hold families together. So family is going to be of the utmost importance, and this really definitely ties into children being obedient to their parents. It also meant to emphasize ancestor veneration. So even though family members that lived before you may have been passed, it was still considered important to worship your ancestors and also make them proud, and conduct yourself in a manner that they would be proud of. So that also emphasized that social hierarchy and those relationships and proper behaviors. Ren was the kindness and benevolence as practiced in the 5 basic relationships. So unlike legalism, the context of this is that you are treating each other well. And Confucius also felt that this was the expectation for rulers as well, and this ties into the mandate of heaven, that if you're acting as a just ruler over your subjects, you should be able to remain in power. Li is a sense of propriety. Basically, this means, behavior in public. Requires people to treat one another according to convention. It also emphasize orderly rituals that demonstrate respect. So in fact, in the Analects, he even goes so far as to discuss what people should wear in public, how do they treat one another. So it was a pretty intricate system of behaviors. So basically, this puts people in control of their own behavior. And this means that it encourages people to become active citizens. You should always actively be conscious of your behavior and how you're treating one another and how you're engaging in those social expectations. And that's going to almost be the exact opposite of Taoism, which we're going to see in a moment, where it actually encourages people to retreat from social expectations and just actually engage in nature and the natural forces at work. So we have a brief video there on Confucius. So our second major belief system that also emerged because of the period of the Warring States as a philosophy to try to determine how to maintain social harmony was Taoism. You also will see this spelt with a T and pronounced Taoism. In fact, the video I show, I believe, uses Taoism, so just know it's the same thing. Basically because of trying to translate Chinese into English, there's been a lot of different variations on translations over time. So Taoism encourages people to retreat from society and develop a reflective and introspective consciousness. And through that process, you follow the Tao, or the way of nature. Since Tao is inevitable, meaning nature is kind of this larger force at work, and you can't really fight it. And that's what they're going to argue, is this is how that can be applied to government, that a government that does not fight nature is the one that's going to be most harmonious. And greedy rulers are against nature, and they're resisting nature. And so that's how this philosophy ties into government leadership. But since Tao is inevitable, human beings must learn to live in harmony with it, which is the path of least resistance. So this is not being an active citizen, it's more or less being passive and just following the path. Governments under control of ambitious men try to define nature, and as a result they end in ruin. So this values disengagement, known as Wu Wei, from affairs of the world. And then to conclude this video here, you've got your final video on Taoism.